All right, let's get started. So welcome everyone to our webinar today. My name is Seth Julian. I am OFN's Chief Network Officer, and thank you for joining our webinar today on Equipped for Impact, Technology Adoption and Implementation. This is our second week of Connect Plus Forum webinar programming. Next slide. So just really quick before we get started, just a couple of things. So number one, this webinar is being recorded. So we will post the webinar on CDFI Connect as well as our YouTube channel in the coming days. Number two, please use the chat function on Zoom. So you just put in your name, where you're from, just engage with all the attendees that are joining us today. And then lastly, please use the question and answer box to ask specific questions. We are hoping we'll have around 10 minutes at the very end of our webinar, where we'll be able to answer some of the questions that you pose in the Q&A. Next slide. So first, I would really just like to acknowledge our sponsor of our entire Connect Plus Forum webinar series, the Citi Foundation. It's really developed in support with our partners at the Citi Foundation. And really, this is helping kind of build and facilitate access to tools, skills, and expertise that will help our members and other CDFIs really meet their missions more effectively. Next slide. So for those of you that are new to the Connect Plus Forum, this is OFN's kind of annual virtual event for the industry. It's really focused on delivering action-oriented conversations on pressing topics in our members' work. This year's theme is really focused on CDFIs and technology. So we have a series of webinars and office hours this month where we're exploring the role of technology in our field within our organizations, from emerging trends to the nuts and bolts of systems implementation. Our goal is that through these sessions, you'll come away with new perspectives and actionable strategies for integrating tech into your work. As part of the forum recap in February, we'll also be sharing new resources, tools, and templates that you can utilize to build on the concepts and topics raised during the forum. One of these resources is a loan management software buy guide that will allow members to compare key characteristics and qualities of loan management software on the market, with the intention of making it more efficient for CDFIs to understand the available options. Like last week, we kicked off the forum with a conversation on how to move beyond buzzwords to build a tech-ready culture in your organization. This session, we're really kind of shifting towards execution and focusing on how and when we can use technology adoption and implementation. So we are excited for this webinar and our speakers. If you can go to the next slide. So I am joined today by Amanda Blondow, who's the Chief Strategy Officer for Northern Initiatives, Emily Seifel, who's the Executive Director of Fund Community Institute, and Gopal Narasimhan, who's the Chief Digital and Technology Officer at Hope Enterprises. So thank you all for joining us. I want to start really quick by just having each of the panelists just for 1 minute tell us a little bit about your organization yourself. So Emily, why don't I start with you?
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emily Sipfli. I'm the Executive Director of Fund Community Institute. We are a think tank that focuses on the CDFI industry. Our research is conducted through independent projects, commission projects, and can take the forms of reports, training, or other forms of sharing knowledge like today's webinar. So I'm excited to be here to share some of our recent work, which was related to CDFIs and technology, by speaking to practitioners in the field.
Great. Thank you, Emily. And Gopal, how about you? Gopal's at an airport, by the way, so bear with us if you hear something on the loudspeaker. Gopal, go ahead.
Thank you, Seth. My name is Gopal Narasimhan. I am the Chief Digital and Technology Officer at Hope Enterprise Corporation, Hope Credit Union. Hope Credit Union is a CDFI loan fund credit union and policy institute that's based in Jackson, Mississippi. We impact about 120,000 people living in the 5 states that we serve: Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee. More than half of our people, the members who joined us, were either underbanked or unbanked when they joined Hope. And we're a Black-owned and women-owned business. Currently celebrating our 30th year. So very excited to be here and wanting to, sharing my insights on technology for all of you.
Great. Thank you for being here. And Amanda.
Hi, I'm Amanda Blondow. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Northern Initiatives. Northern Initiatives is a small business lender that focuses on providing loans and know-how to entrepreneurs that are looking to start and grow in Michigan. I actually started with the organization 21 years ago as an IT manager and network administrator, and then actually did IT consulting and moved into through different roles at the organization. So excited to be here today.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. All right. First question, I think I'm just going to start with Emily. So Emily, can you just talk a little bit about why it's important for CDFIs to focus on technology adoption? And is there anything in particular that you've kind of found that organizations struggle with?
Yeah, I think my co-panelists could probably answer that question as well, of just seeing kind of the impact of a good technology adoption within their organizations. But I think across the industry as well, we've got some recent examples of why technology adoption could be so important. The pandemic, for example, previous to this role, I worked with a bunch of CDFIs in a consulting role, and it was clear those that had a strong technology footing did better in that kind of transition to remote work, were more nimble in how they are reworking their project flows and underwriting processes, the whole works, as the pandemic hit. And then also as they were able to take on new funds and deploy them in new ways, those that had that strong technology footing were able to really participate that and roll out funds. But I think from a broader picture, it's just part of what makes a successful organization in 2025. It's just being aware of what's out there, not being resistant to change, and understanding what the opportunities are, kind of from that like culture and mentality perspective. That was a focus of last week's webinar.
Great.
Where they struggle most, it can really comes down, I think, to that change management, and again, that culture and understanding how to really make it a part of the day-to-day work. A lot of times technology is viewed as one person's job or a discrete project, and it's not necessarily that. It's part of the life cycle of the organization and the change and really changing what you do to stay nimble. I think I've now said for the third time, but that could be really a struggle for some organizations, and something that can be often a part of this process of a technology adoption.
Fantastic. All right, so I think Amanda and Gopal, just same question to both of you. We'll start with Amanda first, but can you just kind of share within Northern Initiatives, is there a specific like tech implementation or adoption that you think was successful that you just want to highlight for him?
Well, they're all successful, of course. The ones that are most successful, we took more time to start with what were the requirements? What were each of the users that were going to utilize the platform? And one that I'm thinking of right now is when we were thinking about moving from spreadsheets to actually a loan underwriting and origination system. So each person that touched that process, we gathered their requirements, then we prioritized, because there's a lot of wishes, and those need to be weighed with the requirements as well. But also, just thinking about, we are changing, what the needs are. And so that was something we also thought about too. But it was a very detailed process. It took some time, and I don't want people to get scared by that. I just want people to know that the more you invest upfront, the better it's going to be and more likely to be successful later. And so that loan origination, there was hard parts, right? Change is hard. It took us time, but it actually, we've now done more loans than we've ever done last year, and we're continuing to grow, and it's much easier to onboard somebody into our loan system.
No, that's great. Looking forward to diving more about how you do prioritize. But Gopal, what about you from Hope's perspective? Any kind of specific implementation or adoption that stands out to you that was a success?
Yeah, I can talk about a couple of things. I've been with Hope now 6 months. So I'll talk about the 6 months I've been with Hope, because prior to that, there's been a lot of technology that Hope has successfully implemented. I'll take a lens of an inside the Hope, outside the Hope view. Inside the Hope, what I mean by that is internal technology, right? Technology that helps our associates be smarter and better. We moved to our board meets every month. And to put the board packet together as a 55-slide presentation, that took 10 man days for somebody to do. Within the last 2-3 months, we have made that completely automated into a Power BI dashboard. So that saved us 10 different, 10 man days for a month, which we are now deploying, and we have taken on a lot more optimization work in terms of how do we automate data and help data drive decision making at Hope. So that's the internal use case. An external use case that I'm really excited about is we commissioned a third-party digital products and consulting vendor to go and talk to our members. We just completed that exercise. We got some of the results last week, but it was eye-opening in terms of our members, underbanked, unbanked members in the deep south, but the amount of technology they use on a day-to-day basis and their general apprehension about the financial system, giving us a lot more things to think about in terms of how do we serve the market. But I'll get into depth in each of this as we move forward, Seth, if you want me to hold and come back to it.
Yeah, that's definitely come back to that. That's great. Thank you. So Emily, can you just share a little bit? So Fund kind of did a great kind of survey and publication where they interviewed just tech providers to CDFIs. And I'm wondering if there's anything from your perspective, either with talking with the other tech providers or just what you learned, is there anything, how should organizations think about starting just a tech adoption process? Like what should they be thinking about before they actually start doing the adoption, the implementation?
Yeah, thank you to that nod for the research. That really informs a lot of my comments here today, because I ended up speaking to 16 of these tech providers that CDFIs on the call might be going to, and that was an interesting way of hearing all the ways that what didn't work, what they would like their customers to be coming with. I think Amanda touched on one of those pieces that kind of rose out of those interviews, is that really talk to folks throughout your organization and understand what they need, understand what the end user, who's going to be the power user of whatever technology platform it is, needs, which might be different than someone who just has to check in occasionally from dashboards, and try and be inclusive in that process. But also folks across kind of the organization have to be involved for that adoption piece, that cultural piece that I touched on. So you don't just have a nice, shiny new software that no one ever uses. It really has to be an all-in process. And two, I would say, know what problem you're trying to solve before you even start those conversations. Those folks that are interviewed time and time again said that was one of the main reasons timelines went long, or implementations took longer, and were therefore more expensive, is when you had to reiterate and redefine what you were trying to do. So being clear about what problems you're trying to solve and realistic of what you can get done with your budget as you go into the process can really tighten up some of the timelines. It's not the end all be all, but just really know what you're trying to do can save time and money in the long run.
That's great. And then I guess just a follow up on that. I mean, did anything bubble out from a tech provider where they would like support a CDFI thinking through like an adoption? Is there anything out there that you saw?
I think that's a good point too. And something that as folks are going out and considering what vendor they might want to work with, I think that's a key question to ask, is just understanding how much of a consultation do they do once you've kind of signed on the bottom line. What does that first step look like? Is there a discovery process? Will they help you transform old data to the new system? Just how much work and support on that front end that provider can do for you. That can be tied to budget and timeline too. So it may not be possible, but like how much help you can get from the vendor, or at least knowing what you're going to get on that front end support, consultation, and design can be really helpful too.
Fantastic. All right, Amanda, let's dive in a little bit just about like the loan origination, right? So moving from spreadsheets to an actual like system. Can you just like walk us through kind of how Northern Initiatives, what was that process like? Like, how did you actually get staff involved in? Like, how did you start thinking through like needs that were needed?
Well, first we had a lead. So there's somebody who actually worked with the system and did a lot of already kind of oversaw processes and wrote a lot of documentation and oversaw, kind of was our credit manager, looking at that loan operations side. So that was our lead. So, and also gave space so they could actually take some time to focus in on this project. Then we identified what are the different roles, and we had already kind of had an analysis of the different parts. So from lead to application to underwriting to close, who is involved in all of that, and making sure that we understand what do they each need. And so then that created our sheet, and we also created a committee that allowed us to have those different perspectives, because not only are we getting, this is what we want, but everybody's going to hear something a little bit differently based on what their role is, or be able to ask following questions. But we also wanted standard questions that we asked every vendor. And so that was one of the ways that we started that process. And again, really defining the, like, what do we have to have versus what's nice to have, because that scope creep can get really big. And then you're like, oh, it's all these bells and whistles, but really you use 10% of the system. And in the end, we need to make sure it does those basic things that we're looking for.
And then just from a timeline perspective, like roughly how long was that like process from you, like kind of with assessing the needs to actually then, let's just say actually purchasing software?
It's been a while. All I know is it always takes longer than expected, just like a construction project. Put a little bit of a buffer in there. But I can't remember the exact timeline, but it was a good amount of time, especially once we started to get down to the final details, because we also wanted to customize the system. And so there was setup that needed to be done, a lot of training, and thinking about how to integrate it into our other systems as well.
Okay. And I think there was a question about what loan origination system you actually ended up going with.
We ended up going with Spark.
Okay, thank you. All right, Gopal, just from your end, as CDFIs on the call, like there are a lot of smaller CDFIs on the call, right? And I think as a lot of our members who are 3 to 6, 7 people on staff, they have lots of different kind of job titles that they do. Like, what are some high level things that you think like a smaller CDFI can take away as they think about like needs and assessment that they may have for a tech solution?
No, that's a great question, Seth. And to me, I didn't share this at the top of my introduction, but I spent 20 years at FedEx prior to joining Hope. And then when I left FedEx and I joined Hope, it's just much smaller organization compared to a global behemoth. And one thing that's common to both of my experiences is, technology and all of these things come secondary to me. The first thing comes is the mindset. Like, how do we look at our organizations, however small, however big, and see how can we drive change within the organization, and how do we bring the right mindsets to it? And what I mean by that is one thing I learned in my experience is data and technology are two different things. Many times what happens is you might have, if you have a loan origination system, you could have a banking system, you could have, over time, most organizations end up with 5 or 6 different systems, and you think you would need to renew these systems or go through a complete transformation process before you get to value. And then you get stuck with, hey, this is a 5-year contract, that's a 3-year contract, this is a 6-year contract. And then you're like, I can't do anything now because that system is doing this system is doing that. One thing you can do is pull all the data that you have in these different systems into a central place. Connect the dots between the systems. You don't have to renew systems. You can use the data to make more smart, intelligent decisions, and also get a better perspective of your business holistically, about your members or about your customers or the communities that you serve. You can bring those elements together. And that's, this dashboard that I was talking about earlier was just a proof of concept for that. And we have a whole lot of initiatives that we are going to do, because once you get to that point where you get 80% of the data in, the next use case you're going to need, you'll just need 3% more or 4% more of data, and that ecosystem keeps building. And you free yourself up from those renewal timelines and cycles to deliver value. Those still are needed, because at some point, you have to look at the cost to value and see whether you have the right vendors on board. But you can do a lot of things with data while you're waiting for the next big thing. That's one thing I would share. That for however big the organization is, because I've done it in a big organization, I've done it in a smaller organization, and any CDFI I walk into, that's probably one of the first things I will look at is, how can you take the data that you have and put it to use in a more intentional and powerful way?
That's great. Awesome. So we talked a little bit about this, but I think this is something I want to spend a little bit of time on, is just actual vendor selection. There are, I think the industry in general is growing, and I think there are more vendors out there who are becoming interested in CDFIs, which I think is fantastic. But at the end of the day, like you do need to make sure that you're selecting the right vendor, the right system that kind of can get you everything that you need. So I want to start a little bit with Emily here, just because you actually did the research on this. But can you just talk a little bit? I would like, if you can, think about from a CDFI practitioner side. Like you did all the interviewing of tech providers. Like if there's a couple of things that you could take away from those interviews that a CDFI practitioner could like leverage better to actually select the right vendor, what would those be?
I think two things come to mind. The first I was starting to touch on in my last response, but I would ask a lot of questions about what support looks like at the front end, that consultation piece and kind of systems mapping we were talking about just before, to really understand like how much work might be done by the provider and how much would we need to get our own data cleaned up, as Gopal was just saying. But the flip side of that too is, what does support look like on the back end? Like at the end of the implementation period, is the project just done? Or is there ongoing training? Are there ongoing updates provided to the software? Do you have a partner that you can go to if you need a new report created? Or will you have to make the report yourself? I'm not sure there's one way that's better or worse. I think it'll depend on the in-house capabilities of each CDFI and budget. But just knowing what you're going to get, if it is just like, great, our implementation's over, best of luck. Or if you do have a kind of ongoing partner, more sophisticated CDFIs might not need as much handholding going forward. It's kind of an in-house versus contracted decision making. The second thing I would think about as a practitioner is considering your whole technology stack. And this goes to what Gopal was just saying. There can be overlapping contracts. There can be different systems that are trying to shuffle data back and forth in various ways. People might have to touch 5 systems in a day. I would ask a provider questions about, what does integrations look like? Will it just be an automatic integration, or am I going to have to be downloading a spreadsheet, uploading it somewhere else? There's lots of different ways to do it. And again, I'm not sure there's one, there's probably better ways for data integrity to make sure things don't get lost along the way, but those come with trade-offs of cost. But that's something to ask of vendors as you're considering that process too. Just how much will the data need to move around? In terms of an overall technology stack, is a particular vendor you're talking to a part of it, or will you need to add on other functionalities as well? Just how are all those vendor relationships going to ultimately be interacting with each other? One thing that's great is these things can be done in pieces. Perhaps if you can't take on a full update, maybe you can tackle one portion. Maybe you're adding on a customer portal, like if that's provided by one person, but you need to understand how that's going to interact with all the other pieces that you have.
That's great. One follow-up. I'm just curious, how for this, the tech providers that you interviewed, like how core were CDFIs as like a customer base for them? I'm just curious in general, as the industry is growing, are they viewing CDFIs as kind of like a key segment that they want to try to attract?
I think when I was doing my interviews, this was, I would say it was there was a divide, certainly. I think there were some that kind of have come out of the CDFI industry, that this is always what they were. They were maybe CDFIs themselves that identified that the tech solutions were lacking, and so they made them themselves, that sort of thing, where it's come from the CDFI industry. And then on the other side, there are external players that are developing CDFI specific things as a business line. That might be adding a TLR reporting functionality or something to an existing lending platform, or creating something from scratch that's aimed at CDFIs. But I did sense a divide of the folks I talked to, that some were like always from CDFIs, added technology, and some that were the flip, started technology, added CDFIs.
Yeah, thank you. Just curious.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Amanda and Gopal. So just let's talk a little bit about how to select the right vendor. So Gopal, I'll start with you this time. I think both from your previous experience at FedEx and just in the corporate world to kind of where you are now, what are 2 or 3 things that CDFI should really be like zeroing in on as they think about vendor selection?
I think Emily did a fantastic job. I think you want to involve the users at the top, because the more you have the users who are ultimately going to use the solution, the more easier it's going to be adopting, easier for them to adopt. So having them in the process becomes key. The data side of it, sometimes what happens is you have a vendor will say, here is what you're going to get. And then tomorrow you want to, some more pieces, they'll say, hey, you know what, you got to buy that from me. Even though it's your data sitting in their system, you might need to pay for it down the line. So for me, you want to think about the use cases that you're trying to do. Are you trying to improve your throughput? Are you trying to expand you're going from one market to another market, or within the market, you want to provide 2 or 3 more services? Look a little bit beyond that, especially if you're going to sign a 5-year or a 10-year contract. You want to think a little bit more, get into an ideation mode and say, in case, if your business takes off crazy over the next 2-3 years, which I hope it does, and you're able to support a lot more people, what would that look like? And make sure you have those use cases, detailed out upfront. So when you have this vendor selection process, you're not getting into a situation was, 2 years from now, I need 4 more things, I got to renegotiate the contract, and then you're not in a great spot. So again, you don't have to buy all of it, but having that conversation helps you get a better deal out of the vendor. At the end of the day, it is a negotiation. We are CDFIs, but in many instances, the companies that you're going to work with, the vendors, are not non-profits. They are for-profit organizations. So keep that in mind. Another piece that I'll want to put some focus on is some of the non-functional things that goes into contracts. These might not be the most top of mind things for an average CDFI person, but termination clauses, warranties, you go look at, what happens if there are indemnities that needs to happen in there is a legal situation that arises. What happens when service gets disrupted from a vendor? What about cybersecurity? So when you start looking at those types of things, even if you're a small CDFI and you don't have the right legal expertise or those types of expertise to guide you, raise that expertise. Go to some of your good partners and see whether those partners can give you an hour of their lawyer's time or something like that, so you can read through the contract. So some of these things might seem daunting, but if you want to negotiate the best deal from a vendor, you might just want to seek out those expertise that you don't have. And that's what I was talking about mindsets earlier. There's a lot you can get access to if you ask. And you might be familiar, you might be super comfortable in asking for, money, which is what a lot of CDFIs do, but ask for expertise in places where you don't have it. And that's how you can, it just doesn't apply for vendor, but from a vendor selection perspective, those aspects of complex pieces in the contract, especially if you're dealing with a larger company, it helps to pay attention to those clauses as well, sir.
That's great. Thank you. Amanda, what about on your end, Northern Initiative? Anything to add to just vendor selection and kind of what you were looking for?
One of the things we've done, we talked to other CDFIs. What are you using? If you've already implemented this or worked with that vendor, can we have a meeting? Could we work through it? And actually, when we were doing the evaluating loan origination, we went to Duluth and talked to Entrepreneur Fund, and they helped share their systems. And whether it's been a developer that we're looking for, a platform, we do a lot of research and testing. The other thing, being able to have demos and walk through scenarios, I think is really helpful too. Where things have kind of fallen short is like, okay, all the criteria sounds great, but then when you actually go into implementation and setting it up, find that it can't actually handle a use case. So making sure to do that earlier. The other thing that is also asking about data security. Most of these vendors should have, that in place, but that is so important for thinking about cybersecurity, backups, really just making sure that, we're securing and doing the best we can with that data that we're getting from our customers. Those are just a couple I'd add.
Yeah. And then I guess I think for all of you, so obviously you can talk to other CDFIs who may be using that vendor, but are there any other, like Gopal or Amanda, is there anything else that kind of stood out of kind of how you vet a provider? And I guess on Emily's side, did anything come out in your kind of interviews about providers, like wanting to make sure that they had enough recommendations or referrals for CDFIs?
One thing I can add is, when you talk to 2 or 3 different vendors for a particular use case, you will see who is more empathetic to you. Who is asking the questions that is making sense to you. Some people, some vendors are basically, here is my product, here's how you need to use it, as opposed to some vendors who are like, here is my product, here is where you are, here are the 2 or 3 things you need to do to get the best value out of my system. And many times this happens because you will get the first version of the technology in, and there's already a lot of things can go wrong with this. You're trying to change the technology. There's a lot of change management that goes on, and then you stop, right? There's like 10 features, you probably used 1 or 2, and then you never come back to it. So as long as you think about these things up front and say, okay, it's going to take 6 months to put this thing in place, will you be open to a monthly conversation with me to see what else can I do? How else can I improve? Can I have a user forum with you to ask questions? How do I compile those things? And we can, you can do that in the most efficient ways. You can collect it and have a monthly call. But those are the things that I feel like vendors that are willing to do those things are going to be more supportive of you through the journey than somebody who's like going to give you a solution, and then every time you go to them, they might say you got to renew, you're going to add on to something or something like that. So empathy is something I look for in my vendor set.
No, that's great. That's great insights. Amanda or Emily, anything to add to that?
I was going to share, 2 years ago, we were looking for a developer for our platform. And so I have actually the criteria, like I was looking at their size and staffing. I was, thinking about where are the workers, who's actually doing this work, who am I going to get to work with, how do they collaborate? When I know Emily had talked previously about thinking about that, how they also support implementation, they helped us create a playbook on how we, enroll everything. So it wasn't only just the programming, but what was that additional support. I was looking for somebody that, I felt comfortable that they're going to be around for some time, what their customer services and support cost. I will say some of the things that came into play too, is I had multiple conversations. I'd hear some people would just try to say yes right away, but then the budget would go, it would start to shift, and I didn't feel like I could trust I was getting real numbers. And with the vendor we actually went to, immediately when they're like, this is really where it's going to start out, and I had to come back around and go, okay, I think that's more realistic. And throughout that process, we also had check-ins. We knew every 2 weeks, we're going to review where we're at. We're going to have workable code. We'll have progress towards our budget. So there was also things in play that made me feel more comfortable.
That's great. From your side, Emily, anything?
Nothing on my side. I spoke to these folks with kind of that research perspective, but I think what Amanda and Gopal said, you could take that to heart.
All right, so we have selected a vendor. Now we need to get into kind of implementation and rollout. So let's start on the CDFI practitioner side here with Amanda and Gopal for. So first, can you just talk a little bit about how you have managed rollouts within your organization? Are there like frameworks and tools that you recommend or that you use that were kind of successful? And kind of also, if you can talk a little bit about like then training of staff and how to get kind of staff involved as well. So how about we start with Gopal?
Sure, Seth. Like I said, if you have done this right, then the users are involved at the top, right? So when it comes to the time of implementation, it becomes much easier if the users have been involved at the top and they understand, they've been in the demos and all of the things that we talked about. But once you start the implementation clock, it depends on what the situation is. Are you implementing a new technology, or are you implementing a technology or replacing a technology? Replacing a technology becomes a lot more complicated, simply because you need to run probably both at some point of time. You need to have, till this gets stable, you need to have the older version running. And you get a budget for that. You got a budget from a timing perspective. And there are 2 things to it. There is going to be a lot of change management here. There are users who are going to say, I don't want the new solution. It's going to make me change things. And they'll stick to the old solution. You got to be empathetic to that for a little bit. But as soon as you have your early adopters, leaders of the user groups that are going to say, okay, it's ready for adoption, some point you have to cut it off. That's a tough call. That's where you need to align with your business partners and make sure you're aligned. Otherwise, what happens is you have the cost is double because you're going to have both the solutions running for longer than you planned. And that's going to create a significant budget pressure for you, and then every day you're going to have less value come out of the new solution because you're running two solutions. That is key to me. And how do you manage that? You manage that through transparency. You manage that through clarity of what is it in this system that is not working there. Is it just a different way of doing things, or is there a real gap? And is that gap critical or non-critical? The more you document it in this fashion, and then you bring the right parties to have a conversation and say, okay, can I get over these three things in a week? Okay. And at some point, you just have to cut it off. Otherwise, you're never going to transition to the new system. So that's kind of my learning is when you're transitioning from system A to system B, you got to be really clear about your timelines, deliverables, and have a open, collaborative, transparent, empathetic process to drive the adoption curve, Seth.
Yeah. So the one thing that stood out to me, what you said, is about early adopters. Like, I think that is key. Like when OFN has done this, like a successful implementation typically has very early adopters, and typically they are of influence and can kind of help with the change management. Like just in your history and your background, like any guidance or support of how to get more early adopters on board?
I think it goes with collaborative discussion with my business partners. Like I am in technology, so you would have a loan operator, line of business leader. You sit down with them and then you say, okay, who are the people that you would want in the early adopter program? You elevate the early adopter program to make it a career progression. You can elevate the early adopter path as something that you can reward and award in public to make sure that those people feel like they are the ones that are taking the risk, because they are the ones that are going to find the bugs. They are the ones that are going to find the process technology people gaps, So you elevate that position and you take feedback from your peers in terms of who those people are, and then you support them like crazy. From an IT perspective, 24/7, 24/7, you give them the cell phone. If they call you at 2 a.m. in the morning, hopefully in this business, in this business, probably customers are not coming in. My previous business, it was a 24/7 operation. I've gotten call at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m. in the night. But you build the trust as a technology team with your business partners to say, we are there for you. We will not drop you. And that creates that flywheel of positive energy that then hopefully feeds to the rest of the organization, sir.
Great. And Amanda, from your perspective, kind of just walk us through or talk us through kind of a successful implementation at Northern Initiatives. Like, what did that look like? What insights can you kind of share?
First, as I'd mentioned, we had actually had this playbook that we stepped through of, how are we preparing for this? What is the timeline for getting everybody set up? And this was actually when we were transitioning from one system to another, and we had outside people, so they weren't as involved in the process. They still, like, we tried to communicate as early and as much as we could of like, this is what this means, this change means. This is how the timing for it. We also did a kind of like a pilot group or a test group. When you have a restaurant, you want to do a soft opening first. That's kind of what we did too, so that we could test this playbook and be able to make some tweaks. We learned a lot through that process and we're able to analyze it. The other thing I wanted to just bring out, because this was something that I learned later on, is I am an early adopter. And also I've been, with my background in technology, I'm already thinking like, oh yeah, we could do this, this, and this. So I would think people are in the same part of the change curve as me. And I would try to say, well, this is going to be great. This is why. But they're actually that part of like, how does this affect my job? How, like the emotional part of it too. So just as you think about early on to implementation, if we can have people in the same kind of area of that change curve, it's not always going to be the same, but if we're answering the questions, like Gopal said, along the process, providing information, and then having that, like, this is what our timeline is. we might have to adjust it, but what else are we missing? What else do I need to think about? And so that really helped us by actually having that written out for the playbook, the communications we were going to do. And we learned, as we went through that process, and it actually went smoothly. There's always going to be bumps. That's part of technology and moving through that. But I think that was really, really helpful for us.
That's great. Thank you, Amanda. And then I guess, Emily, I don't know from your side, just if there's anything you might be able to add from like the vendor or provider side, if anything that you learned that could, result in just a better implementation process from that side.
Yeah, I feel like I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but again, getting folks involved on that onset so you can work. I love the idea of your playbook, Amanda, too, but just and some of those cultural shifts can go more smoothly, and being very clear of what you're trying to solve at the beginning so you don't have those like scope creeps and timeline stretches that can really slow things down.
All right. So I think we got 2 more questions for the group here. So if people do have questions, they can type it into the Q&A. But now we kind of we have implementation in, like we are utilizing whatever system it is. Can we just talk a little bit about like monitoring of that, or making sure that we are either optimizing it? So like, what are some kind of strategies there that that CDFIs can kind of leverage as we look to like monitor the success of what the implementation was? So from I guess, Amanda, from your side, anything stand out to you on that end?
I actually get asked about Salesforce a lot. That's one of the CRMs we use, or we use that CRM. And they'll say, well, how do you get people to use it? We created it. We heard others thought it was great. How do you get people to use it? It's implemented. We can't go back and change it. So now it's about how do we actually use it and present that data. So what we do is actually weekly, we have whole staff meetings where we pull in data from Salesforce that says what TA was provided last week. And it's got other information like what fund development is happening, what reports are going out. So you can very much see that this is something we're using. We also monthly look at a company dashboard that's developed. It's all in the Salesforce based on the data we have there that tracks where we are towards our goals. And, we walk through that all together and review it too. So I think part of it comes down to, we accomplish what we measure. And so I think part of it is also just building that into the process, and it helps to reinforcing why it's important.
Great. Gopal, you're in from monitoring.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit to what Amanda said, and I think she did a fantastic job. You need to think about what is it that you want to measure, and what is it that you can measure. Sometimes you might want to measure 15 things, but then you just don't have the data ecosystem or the data or the capability, or it's sitting in 4 different places that you're stretching the team. So a prioritization initiative for me is, if I have a KPI, if I have, say, members per FTE, or if I have, loan, the time that it needs to stay in a certain stage within the origination process. If I'm going to measure that, then I would ask the question, what actions would I change based on this information with my group? If I've had several conversations with my business partners at Hope where they say, I need all of this, but I'm going to ask, what are you going to do with it? So then you ask that question, you ask it 3 or 4 times, then you know that they're going to take 3 actions, and for them, they need 1 or 2 KPIs. So then you can kind of hone in around that, put a program around that. If it's going to be some manual effort to it, you put the manual effort, and then you kind of see, how do you automate that? Is there a possibility to automate that? And then you change that forward, right? So sometimes I see a lot of information. I'm talking about this board dashboard that I was talking about, 55 pages. The moment we produced that in a dashboard, our CEO was like, do we even need all of this? How do we reduce this to a smaller number, and how do we give it to a board? Because you're asking a board, set of individuals who are not familiar with the business as intimately as us to read all of this as well. Like, why would they need to read these pages? This is the conversation it's created. So if you pick the right item, if you have the right conversations around KPIs, and those KPIs, if you can tie it to clear actions in terms of what needs to happen, 1, you will measure less, and 2, you will do a lot more with the things that you measure.
Great. Thank you. And then Emily, I guess from your side, anything that kind of stands out from your...
Yeah, I think my comments might focus more on like the optimizing and thinking through if you have that ongoing relationship with the vendor, how they can help you optimize it too. You know, some I spoke to have ongoing trainings. Can you make sure folks are taking advantage of it as needed? Some that I spoke to have like a help desk that's always available to end users. Do you have a relationship that they can help aggregate some of the concerns that your team is having? Like one of the people I talked to that had a help desk, they mentioned that they sometimes felt like people would just come to them to do stuff instead of learning how to do it themselves, because they were very helpful. They could make those changes, but could you aggregate some of those common challenges your team has that come up in training and make it more of a formalized training to just, instead of one-off tickets, can you make it implemented a training system?
Okay. All right, so this is my last question, then we'll open it up just to kind of Q&A, but I'll start with Emily. So like, what advice would you give CDFIs planning for their next phase of technology growth?
I think we've had some clear themes and probably things I've said too much that have come up already. And so I'll add in a couple different ones for my end remarks. The first is that you can only get good outcomes with good data. So if you want to have good things to measure, you have to be thinking about how you're collecting them too. The technology itself is not going to solve the problem of your data quality if you're not collecting it well. And the second is, when I was speaking to these providers, one of the questions I asked is, what do you think are big changes for CDFIs on the horizon, or what do you think they should be concerned about? And I originally did these interviews in early 2024, so I asked about AI in particular. And so many of them said that there's lower hanging fruit that CDFIs can be concerned with. So I guess my advice would be, if you've been listening to this webinar and you're really overwhelmed, there's so much to think about, so many phases, there might be some really easy things that you could do too. Like maybe some simple lower hanging fruit, like improving your data security is a good place to start too.
Thank you. All right, and then Amanda and Gopal, same question to both of you. We'll go Gopal first, but basically, like, what is what's the key lessons learned or lesson learned that you would like for the audience to take away from today?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to the empathy piece that I was talking about at the top. Seth. And I can talk about data, AI, and technology, but when we spent the time and listened to our members, and we chose one of our partners in the market, and we spoke to the residents that partner supported. These were single women. These were mothers, single mothers for the most part. And what we heard, just I'm still processing it, to be honest with you. They basically said, going into a financial institution, I feel I'm judged. Because if somebody asks me my credit score, I don't want to go, right? So they use technologies like Cash Apps and Chime and some of the digital tools more than we think they would use, because our initial hypothesis going into this was our market wouldn't use technology. They are in a tech desert. But in today's world, everybody's on Facebook, everybody's on Instagram, and they want easy access to cash, and they are going towards a lot of Venmo, PayPal, all of these different tools that are out there, and they wouldn't want to come into a financial institution that's specifically set up to serve them because they feel like just going in there, they feel judged. So there isn't the more you get deeper and you understand your members, the people that you're trying to serve, the more you can do. Like, one easy example for me is, what we are thinking about is, okay, building a new technology and all of that might take time, but can I use the right words? Can I use the right words to talk to them? If I say bank, what emotional response does it create in them? Should I use a different word? Should I use financial institution? Should I use financial support? When me and my one of my colleagues, my peers, communication person who leads communication at Hope, we were thinking about helping our members develop positive financial habits, and he said the word positive financial habits is very condescending. You can't say it because you feel like they are having negative habits. So we are thinking about calling that financially healthy habits. So when you have the empathy, you will just find ways to take your current things and position it in a way that people will absorb them is kind of my learning set along with all the other things that I can potentially talk about. But this, I think, is a learning that we're just going through the journey, and I'm just fascinated by it, because at the end of the day, you want to serve the people, they should be wanting to use your service. And if that empathy is not seen from you, they're not going to adopt it. And one success story out of this initiative is these individuals which we spoke to, we didn't change anything in our financial technology solutions, nothing. But we're getting a lot more of these residents signing up with us just because we went and talked to them. And all of them are putting more money in their savings account than they did in the past. They're taking more responsibility because we just talked to them empathetically. It's just crazy. That's one lesson I'll leave you all with.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you. Amanda.
That's a really good lesson, Gopal, and I've been through that process too. And words are very impactful. A lot of times when we were testing things, it really wasn't as much about the technology. It was also how people said, I seek advice when I have a challenge, but then they didn't want to be presented with a challenge. They wanted it to be hopeful. So I really resonate with that. I think the one thing I wanted to add in is implementation doesn't stop once you've installed the system and it's up and running. This is an ongoing process. So we can't just think, okay, we're good, everybody's going to use it. Like, this is a change in habits. We need to have ongoing support. Like Emily talked about, does the vendor do that? Is that done internally? So I just want people to think through that of implementation is longer. It doesn't have to be very a heavy load, but it is something we want to be thinking about because it is change.
Wonderful. All right. Well, that is the questions that I had. There is one audience question right now that's specifically for Amanda. We probably have time for one more question if someone wants to type it in. But Amanda, the question for you is just learning a little bit more about the implementation process of Initiate. And how did you get buy-in from all team members? And you probably need to talk a little bit about Initiate, because I don't know if everyone on the call knows exactly what that is.
Sure, I'll give a little background. So Initiate is a platform that Northern Initiatives has created, and I actually was the lead on this starting in 2014, 2015, because we saw there was a need to be able to, we were getting common question from entrepreneurs. So one of the things I think about are like, what are repeated tasks we can automate or be able to support? So we pulled together resources that were on social media, money and marketing management, and had it in one place, and then trained others on how do you use that, other advisors on going through that platform, being able to use that in their advising to supplement. Well, we just did a whole huge upgrade and rollover last year. And so we redeveloped the platform, and this playbook that I was talking about was really related to that, because one of the things we were thinking about, we did a lot of testing early on. So we interviewed all of, we interviewed subscribers, which were advisors, as well as small business owners, to understand what are the, what do you interact, like we had a set of questions, and we actually had an external company do this. So we really went through a human-centered design process. From there, we were able to get our list of requirements and compare to what we had already thought. And there were, for the most part, they aligned, but we also learned some things that helped us drive the development. So throughout that process, we continued to get feedback, testing, we did webinars, we did surveys, we had a small group that was really our key testers along the way. And then, as I mentioned, we actually started out with a small group that were kind of those ones that were already involved in the process pretty deeply, and talked to them about, this is how we're going to train your team. This is how we're going to give you the past data. This is how we, are going to support you during that process. And so we had multiple check-ins, throughout that process, and a lot of communication. And we didn't have anybody drop off while we transitioned, and we thought we would, but it actually was a really successful process. I will say it was a lot of work across the team, but being able to have the support from the vendor, because we hadn't done that before, of doing this huge rollover, they actually walked us through a lot of that, and our team continued to test and revise it along the way.
All right, so I think we're at time here. I think just a couple of things. So Gopal has a plane to catch, so we're going to say goodbye to Gopal. Gopal, thank you very much for joining us today. Safe flight back to Atlanta. Amanda and Emily, thank you so much for your insights and joining us for the webinar. But yeah, thank you all for joining very much. Just really quickly, if I can just pull up the last slide here. So just a couple of things. So number one, so if you're a member of OFN, we have office hours tomorrow. That is about working smarter, not harder, how tech strategies for small CDFIs. Next week, we kind of continue our Connect Plus Forum webinar series where we'll have a webinar on AI and community finance, which is around ethics and opportunities. And then Wednesday, we'll have our final webinar that's really about technology in your community, how we can kind of bridge those divides. Again, please, if you want to kind of, watch this webinar again, it'll be posted on CDFI Connect as well as on our YouTube channel. If you kind of continue to find this conversation interesting, please chime in on CDFI Connect and kind of continue the conversation. But really greatly appreciate everyone's time today and all of our panelists. So thank you very much. Everyone enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we will see you at some point in 2025. Thank you.